Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the internet and the world, and welcome back to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and you are currently tuned in to Season 2, Episode 9, Octopus, the Addendum, plus a bonus talk. You guys voted for it, and I am finally delivering, sorry for the delay there, the Addendum to our series on the Octopus. I really hope that everyone enjoyed that detailed look back on all the events that surrounded the mysterious death of Daniel Casolaro and others. It's a case that I've wanted to cover for some time, but I knew it would be a very difficult case to try and cover and to get all of the real details of it. I didn't realize at the time, though, just how hard it would end up being, how much research it would require, or just how much there really was to the whole story. I had to omit a lot of parts to it for the sake of sticking to what was mostly provable and not get bogged down in some of the ancillary stuff that didn't really directly affect the story that I was trying to tell. As much as I wish I could, there's really no way to be able to fully remedy that situation here. To try and tell you everything that I left out would take its own multi-part series, and I'm not even kidding about that. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is fill in some of the additional information that should help to hopefully paint a little clearer of a picture of what all went down. This episode, as with virtually all of the BTR type episodes like this, won't make much sense if you haven't heard episode 8 parts 1 through 3. So I would strongly urge you to stop here if you haven't, give that a listen first, and then come back here once you're all caught up. If you listened when they came out, but don't really have the details kind of fresh in your mind, you may want to go ahead and just give those another listen as well first. But now that I've gotten that all out of the way, let's jump back in and try to put a few more of the pieces of this giant puzzle into place and see if the picture gets a little more clear for you. Part 1. The rest of the PROMIS story. If you love courtroom dramas, then this part is definitely for you. This case does more twisting than Snoop Dogg's blunt roller, and it goes a long way in helping to give a clear picture of just how corrupt our justice system can really be. As I mentioned in the main, PROMIS would also go on to be the backbone of the NSA's PRISM software, and fork off into other branches for various government uses, especially within the intelligence community. We'll discuss that a little bit more in a bit though. For now, back to PROMIS and its legal battles between INSLAW and the Justice Department. First, how PROMIS got into the wrong hands. When shown photos in 1992 by investigators, Bill Hamilton and former INSLAW Vice President Dean Merrill, both men would quickly single out the same photo, one that Hamilton's longtime secretary had also singled out in a separate lineup. Both men said that the man in the photo had visited INSLAW in February of 1983 for a presentation of the PROMIS software. Hamilton would identify the man as being Dr. Ben Orr, who claimed during his visit to be a public prosecutor from Israel. He was impressed with the software, which had recently been upgraded to run on the then cutting-edge 32-bit VAX computers, with Hamilton stating, quote, he fell in love with the VAX version. Dr. Orr never returned, though, and never made the purchase that he had promised. That is, of course, as we learned in the course of our investigation, because his real name wasn't Ben Orr, and he definitely wasn't a doctor or a prosecutor. He was Rafi Eitan, chief of the Israeli Defense Forces Anti-Terrorism Intelligence Unit, who was sent there by none other than the U.S. Department of Justice to take a look at the software that they were about to, let's say, misappropriate. DOJ documents I recently uncovered record that one Dr. Ben Orr left the DOJ on May 6 of 1983 with a computer tape containing PROMIS tucked under his arm, which they had stolen shortly after his visit to Inslaw. According to sworn affidavits, it was then given, or sold at great profit, to Israel and as many as 80 other countries by Earl Bryan, who, if you'll recall, was the head of Hadron, Inslaw's chief competitor, as well as he was also a close buddy with business ties to Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese, who was then the presidential counsel. Earl Bryan was also involved, of course, in paying off the Iranians to hold the hostages until Reagan won the election in what would become known as part of the notorious October surprise. A House Judiciary Committee report released in '92 found evidence raising, quote, serious concerns that high officials of the DOJ executed a carefully drawn-up plan to destroy Inslaw and to co-opt the rights to its software. Bryan had first attempted to buy out Inslaw to acquire PROMIS and then use it to sell the modified version, but was turned down. 1 month after this, the DOJ refused to make payments to Inslaw after Bryan had spoken with then Attorney General Meese, who colluded with Bryan to bankrupt Inslaw and to continue illegally using the software until they could legally acquire its rights by picking the bones of Inslaw from bankruptcy. Inslaw, however, wouldn't go down without a fight and would sue the DOJ. Luckily, or we wouldn't know any of this information now. Anthony Prosciutto, then Deputy Director of the Executive Office for U.S. Trustees, which oversees bankruptcy estates on behalf of the court, would come out and state that the DOJ was improperly applying pressure on his office to get them to convert Inslaw's Chapter 11 reorganization into a Chapter 7 liquidation in their effort to get PROMIS. We talked about this a little bit in the main, but I just wanted to go ahead and cover back over all this and get you up to speed. DOJ would unsurprisingly recommend that Prosciutto be fired, stating if not for his, quote, highly irresponsible actions, the department would be in a much better litigation posture than it presently finds itself in, end quote. Most of this I've covered at least in part during the series, but I tried to add context, and we're about to go much deeper into all of this. Federal bankruptcy judge George F. Basin Jr. would rule in 1987 that the Justice Department had acted illegally in trying to put Inslaw out of business. Judge Basin would also send a letter to Ed Meese recommending that he designate an appropriate outside official to review the dispute due to evidence of perjury by DOJ officials. Meese, of course, wouldn't respond. Nearly 3 weeks' worth of trial would go by, and Basin would rule in favor of Inslaw, citing that the DOJ, quote, took, converted, stole Inslaw software by trickery, fraud, and deceit, further stating that the DOJ engaged in an outrageous, deceitful, fraudulent game of cat and mouse, demonstrating contempt for the law and any principle of fair dealing, end quote, and would order them to pay $6.8 million. His verdict would initially be upheld by U.S. District Court Judge William B. Bryant, at least on its first appeal. How do you think that worked out for Basin? If you guessed he was denied reappointment, then you'd be correct, and you probably paid really good attention to the series, which I appreciate. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator Sam Nunn, would also begin an investigation into the Inslaw case. Their chief investigator would quickly get a call from an unnamed senior official at the DOJ, who investigator Ronald LeGrand had known for years. They would inform LeGrand that the, quote, Inslaw case was a lot dirtier for the DOJ than Watergate had been in both its breadth and depth, end quote. The Nunn Committee published its first report recognizing that Inslaw had been a victim of the system and stated, quote, the Justice Department had been uncooperative, refusing to allow witnesses to testify without representatives of their litigation division being present to advise them. The effect of their presence was to intimidate those who might otherwise have cooperated with the investigation, end quote. They also stated that they learned through various channels a number of department employees who desired to speak to the subcommittee chose not to out of fear for their jobs. Meese wasn't the only DOJ head who was corrupt and in on this. Rodney Stitch's 1998 book, Defrauding America, he writes, quote, by misusing the power of their office, 3 U.S. Attorney Generals in the Reagan-Bush administration, Edwin Meese, Richard Thornborough, and Vice President George H.W. Bush's man, William Barr, misappropriated or aided and abetted the theft of the software called PROMIS. Stitch left out one more DOJ official, though, U.S. Attorney William F. Weld, who is implicated in the letter that I shared on the Facebook page as being part of the conspiracy to steal and resell the PROMIS software. After several congressional investigations were attempted, only to be greatly hindered or completely stonewalled and sabotaged by the DOJ, would still end up concluding, or at least suggesting, evidence of wrongdoing by the DOJ, the scandal would become loud enough that simply burying it was no longer an option. Congressional investigators would call for the appointment of a special prosecutor to give the final word on the Inslaw case and get to the bottom of the corruption within the DOJ, or at least that was the plan. Except George H.W. Bush would step in and appoint none other than fellow CIA crony and later AG under Trump, William Barr, to the position. Barr had previously served as Assistant Attorney General, and Deputy Attorney General under Bush and quickly went to work to help cover up the scandal. Barr would appoint former DOJ crony Nicholas Bua to the special counsel to, quote, investigate the Inslaw matter and then report directly and exclusively back to him. This meant that even on the off chance that Bua didn't go along with the cover-up as expected, Barr would be the only one to know what was found. And, of course, he could simply ignore whatever findings and recommendations that he may present to him, and just rule on the matter however he wanted in the end. Similar to what had been done for the CIA when he shielded the agency from the BCCI and BNG investigations and subsequent fallout from them, as well as his work from 73 to 77 when he served as part of the agency's Office of Legislative Counsel, or the OLC, helping them to weather the Church Committee storm. The Bua report, of course, went on as expected, but Bill Hamilton would provide each member of the House Judiciary Committee with another report fully outlining the wrongdoings of the DOJ that contained enough actionable evidence that it would prompt original committee chairman, Congressman Jack Brooks, as well as North Carolina's Democratic Congressman Charlie Rose, to write a bill that would finally force a real in-depth investigation of the DOJ and also the death of Danny Casolaro, as well as demand that the DOJ pay Inslaw all owed reparations. The committee accused the DOJ in the bill of, and buckle up, it's a long list, conspiracy to commit an offense, officer or employee of the U.S. converting the property of another, fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of proceeding before department agencies and committees, tampering with evidence, tampering with a witness, retaliation against a witness, perjury, interference with commerce by threats or violence under the RICO, separate RICO charge, for transportation of stolen goods, securities, monies, and receiving stolen goods. It would be introduced as Bill H.R. 4862 in the House on July 29, 1994, where, no surprise, it would die without any action by the Democratic leadership during the ending days of the 103rd Congress. In March of 2001, then CIA Director George Tenet would read 2 affidavits together with Hamilton's summary of corroborative evidence and would make a call to a mutual friend of Hamilton's saying that if the info he read is correct, what the government did to the Hamiltons was, quote, unconscionable, and that the Inslaw case needed to be settled, end quote. He also stated that he didn't understand why AG John Ashcroft was failing to settle the Inslaw case, but he was prepared, if necessary, to settle the CIA's part of the case. Tenet also allegedly told the CIA General Counsel to report to him by the following Wednesday on the matter of the CIA's legal liability to Inslaw for payment compensatory damages. You'll no doubt be shocked to hear that a week later, Tenet would call back to say that the General Counsel had advised him not to become involved in the Inslaw affair. Perhaps that's because, according to a memo I uncovered, the agency was offered a government copy of PROMIS as far back as 1981, that being a direct contradiction to repeated denials made by Congress regarding buying or possessing the software, and illustrates clearly that the software was being offered all throughout the federal government from the beginning. This made the software readily available for anyone in the government to review or use even before Earl Bryan and Ed Meese colluded to steal the software and to modify it for resale and distribution. Admiral David J. Murphy, who was Vice President Bush's Chief of Staff from 81 to 85 and had held several other positions in the defense sector as Principal Military Assistant to successive defensive secretaries, and may have played a larger role in the Iran-Contra affair than was realized at the time at least, would speak with Hamilton in September of 2001. In this phone call, he would tell Hamilton that he had been thinking about what he had been told months before regarding the reactions of Tenet, and that he had a hunch that there was, quote, another PROMIS application Inslaw had not yet discovered, and that the additional PROMIS application involved something so seriously wrong that money alone cannot cure the problem, end quote. He would also add that they likely would never be compensated until they discovered that additional use of PROMIS. Murphy would tell Hamilton he was confident that he would figure out that use, and that he would serve as Inslaw's, quote, intelligence guru, and meet with Ashcroft on their behalf to help get the matter settled. Unfortunately, and unsurprisingly at this point, I'm sure, Admiral Murphy would never get that chance, because only weeks later he would die from what was ruled to be a stomach aneurysm. Considering the fact that PROMIS was branched off for use in everything from an intelligence application on board nuclear submarines to inventory tracking for nuclear materials and long-range ballistic missiles, there are no shortage of potential other-use applications Murphy could have been alluding to. None of the widely known applications, well, widely known now for those that are willing to look at least, are really worthy of all the scandals and trail of bodies left in its wake, in my personal opinion. There is one other use application, though, that I briefly discussed in the final episode of the series. One so secretive and so frightening that it is very likely that it would prompt the government, and certainly has, to go to great lengths to keep a lid on it. The government would have been well aware that to fully settle the case could risk its exposure during the proceedings. Something that, if discovered, would be the one thing that would definitely prompt them to settle the matter as quickly and quietly as possible. If you haven't already figured out what I'm referring to, I'm of course talking about the nefarious Main Corps database used to keep track of dissident Americans. While frequently brushed off as a conspiracy or just a rumor, and then even I had given up on its legitimacy before this investigation, to be totally honest, I can now say, however, with great certainty that it is anything but. The PROMIS software, or a slightly modified version, was originally used by soon-to-be Iran-Contra fall guy Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North to first create the dissident list under REX 84, which would later evolve into what would be known as Main Corps. It was essentially a list of American dissidents to closely monitor and round up if necessary under Ronald Reagan's Continuity of Government program involving FEMA. In '93, Wired would describe his use of it as follows, quote, using PROMIS, sources point out, North could have drawn up lists of anyone ever arrested for a political protest, for example, or anyone who ever refused to pay their taxes. Compared to PROMIS, Richard Nixon's enemies list or McCarthy's blacklist looked downright crude, end quote. According to sources, the Main Corps database was accessible only by a small select group of individuals, meaning most in government had no clue of its existence. It would then be passed down from one administration to another administration through national security channels, with each administration adding further revisions. Conosciuto would also warn about both Main Corps and its intended use back in the 1990s. This was around the time that he would blow the whistle to Sherry Seymour for her book, The Last Circle, which was written, or at least revised in summary, at the behest of Congress in their attempt to better understand what exactly Cassolero had uncovered and had deemed the Octopus. In 2008, Salon would run an article detailing more about the Main Corps software and its evolution, written by investigative journalist Tim Schrock. In the article, he would allege some disturbing domestic surveillance activities that ramped up following 9/11, involving the Bush administration's rampant spying on American citizens. He also cited, quote, several former U.S. government officials with extensive knowledge of intelligence operations who stated, quote, a vast amount of personal data on Americans, including NSA intercepts and bank and credit card transactions, and the results of surveillance efforts by the FBI, the CIA, and other agencies was included in the now new and improved version of the Main Corps software, end quote. Radar would also run an article regarding another high-ranking government official with a high-ranking security clearance who backed up Conosciuto's earlier statements as well as others, and stated that Main Corps is a, quote, database of Americans who often, for the slightest and most trivial reason, are considered unfriendly and who, in the time of a panic, might be incarcerated. The database can identify and locate perceived enemies of the state almost instantaneously. According to journalist Chris Ketchum, in 2008, the database had as many as 8 million names in it. These days, according to a former intelligence source, that number is thought to be closing in on the triple-digit millions if it hasn't already surpassed it. The other use for MainCore is believed to be a repository of potential blackmail material of members of Congress and other influential people in government due to its detailed access into virtually anyone's life ever since its creation under Reagan. MainCore would go on to evolve into the NSA's PRISM, as described by Edward Snowden, as well as Boundless Informant, the NSA's powerful tool for cataloging global surveillance data, allowing them to record and analyze where its intelligence came from. It's essentially a top secret, or at least it was, data mining software born from PROMIS framework that details and maps out the absurd amount of information the NSA collects from computer and telephone networks. It works by focusing on counting and categorizing the records of communications known as metadata, rather than the actual content of an email, text, or private message, having to be physically stored, since this would be virtually impossible due to the voluminous amount of data the NSA is constantly collecting. Hamilton became convinced in '92 that this was the primary reason for Danny's murder, the info that he possessed regarding MainCore. Hamilton claims he began receiving information from a U.S. intelligence source through a third party, a retired U.S. Army Criminal Investigative Division officer, saying that, quote, "My intelligence source claimed that Danny was murdered by U.S. Army Special Forces Intelligence Major Joseph Cuellar in the course of a covert intelligence operation. The objective of the operation was to recover every copy of computer printouts from a Defense Intelligence Agency PROMIS-based domestic surveillance database system called MainCore, acquired through the assistance of National Security Agency employee Alan Standorf," end quote. Who we discussed in the main was the would-be NSA whistleblower who was found beaten to death in the back floorboard of his car at the airport. We'll talk a good bit more about that at the end here. While I tend to take anything of this nature coming solely from Bill Hamilton with a large grain of salt, the fact that he identifies both a set of documents that Danny acquired shortly before his death, as well as naming Cuellar as the killer long before the police evidence and witness statements were available, and before his name had really even been associated seriously at all with the case, does lend some credence to this statement. He wondered back then if Cuellar was the man that the hotel maid saw leaving Danny's room the morning that he was found dead. Considering that information was privy only to the Martinsburg police and a handful of people directly involved with the investigation at this point, Hamilton would almost have to have some inside connection to even be aware of that information. Hamilton would bring this info up during a meeting that he and his wife Nancy had between them and Inslaw's attorneys with Assistant U.S. Attorney Stephen Zipperstein and FBI Special Agent Scott Erskine in March of '94. Inslaw attorney Charles Work would bring the matter up in a letter dated March 14, '94 that he wrote to Assistant Associate Attorney General John Dwyer when he wrote the following, quote, "We regard as significant the confirmation from Special Agent Erskine during the meeting that a maid at the Sheraton Inn in Martinsburg, West Virginia, had seen a man leave Mr. Casollero's hotel room the morning of the death. According to Special Agent Erskine, the local police took a statement from the hotel maid in which she gave an eyewitness description of the man she saw leaving the room. A male in his 30s with an excellent suntan, wearing a fashionable t-shirt, dark slacks, and deck shoes." He then brings up news reports that Casollero had been waiting to meet a, quote, dark-skinned man in the hotel bar before asking, quote, "Could that have been the same man whom the maid saw leaving Mr. Casollero's room and whom she described as having an excellent suntan?" Hamilton would be bothered by Dwyer's response of, quote, "I'm troubled by the statement regarding the confirmation by Supervisor Special Agent Erskine of certain facts. In fact, neither Supervisory Special Agent Erskine nor Stephen Zipperstein confirmed any such details to the extent that you understood any part of our meeting as a confirmation of any facts. You are mistaken." End quote. Dwyer would say all of this despite the fact, as we are all now aware, the information that Hamilton had was accurate. From my research, I've found countless high-ranking officials who facilitated the theft, alteration, distribution, or cover-up of the PROMIS software and its subsequent use. Even our soon-to-be officially former President Joe Biden played a small role when he brought the PROMIS software into the U.S. Department of Justice for its use in its U.S. Attorney's offices and was a key figure helping to protect corrupt officials in the Inslaw theft as head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which should come as little surprise to most who listen to this show, and it fits into a much bigger and consistent pattern of corruption and cover-ups in his career, like how he helped cover up for the CIA criminality in the early 80s as a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. When Elliot Richardson was still active legal counsel for Inslaw in March of '89, he wrote a letter to Biden asking him to inform the Attorney General Richard Thornborough of the fact that his committee's chief investigator, Ronald LeGrand, had received serious allegations of malfeasance within the DOJ from an informant he deemed to be credible, and that he should ask for Thornborough's assistance, that reprisals would not be permitted against anyone in the DOJ who came forward with truthful testimony. Biden, however, responded by asking Ronald LeGrand to write a short letter to Richardson in which he essentially refused to do so, invoking the separation of powers doctrine that said the Senate Judiciary Committee wouldn't get involved or intervene in any pending litigation. Richardson responded to Biden saying that he was astonished by his response and that he never requested the Senate Judiciary Committee to interfere in any pending litigation, and that the separation of powers doctrine was totally irrelevant to what he was requesting. Further, he added that he was unaware of any, quote, constraints to committee investigative information, end quote, which LeGrand specified, particularly since the committee had not even carried out any in-depth investigation up to that point. LeGrand would later tell Bill Hamilton, allegedly, that he had never written or signed that letter, and it was instead drafted by a top aide to Chairman Biden, who then forged LeGrand's signature. I have no way of verifying that part aside from Hamilton's statements, but other things I've seen, it certainly wouldn't surprise me to learn that Biden took the cowardly way out. Aside from the fact that it was Danny's introduction into this whole Octopus story, and that it seemed to be a fairly cut-and-dry example of blatant government corruption, the Inslaw case is a key part of our story because of a real and thorough investigation of it would most likely help expose the CIA and top-level government officials' involvement in a wide range of criminal activities, including, but not limited to, Iran-Contra, the BCCI banking scandal, October surprise, along with illegal domestic surveillance, money laundering, arms dealing, and smuggling, as well as political blackmail and murder. Unfortunately, this is also precisely why it never received one, and why it almost certainly never will. There is just simply too much on the line, too many high-ranking officials involved, and it would risk exposing a far darker underbelly of U.S. intelligence and the government as a whole, particularly what has come to be known as the deep state, than the general public could ever imagine, at least. Our system of government is deeply reliant on the notion that it is still by the people and for the people. If the population as a whole was faced with the realization that in reality, our government mostly functions to enrich elected officials and their wealthy donor class, while systematically spying on and propagandizing to and fleecing the people, and that in truth, these days it is increasingly by the globalist and for the globalist, then any remaining illusion of living in a truly fair and free society would vanish. Inslaw and PROMIS is just a strand of a much, much bigger web of deception, one they can't afford to be tugged at, because doing so could expose at bare minimum the modern intelligence and security state and the depths that those in power have gone to and will continue to go to in order to grow and retain that power.
There will not be a cover-up. There will not be an abuse of power in this office. And there is no credible charge that I violated any law, even way back in the dark ages or years ago when this happened. If I did something wrong, it will come out in the special counsel. They will find the truth. Let them do it.
This next part, I guess if anything in this really genuinely makes me nervous, this would be the part. And there's a reason that I left it out of the main story, but I feel like it's important, and it starts to get into something else that I've been trying to convince myself to cover in depth for a while now, but I think it's important, so I'm just going to go ahead and cover it. Part 2. Clinton and Mena, Arkansas connections. Now we get into the part that makes me the most nervous personally, for obvious reasons. To fully break down the entire operation in Arkansas would be deserving of its own episode for sure, but I do at least want to connect a few dots and how they potentially relate to our octopus. This first bit of info comes from William Safire, who was a respected author and journalist who also penned several presidential speeches and was a long-time syndicated political columnist for the New York Times. So we aren't talking about some everyday average crackpot conspiracy theorist here. According to Safire, the exiting Bush Sr. and newly elected Bill Clinton struck a secret deal after the election that the former president would withhold open criticism of the new administration in exchange for Clinton's soft-pedaling of the Iran-Contra investigations. 1 month before the deal was set to expire, however, the Clinton admin would reopen the Inslaw investigation, and in December of '93, the FBI would again start interviewing those closest to Casillero and trying to determine if his death was really a suicide. This new administration wasn't convinced with the finding of the much maligned Buell report, but still seemed concerned with Danny's mental state at the time of his death. His on and off girlfriend and longtime close friend Wendy Weaver would state in an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle, quote, "They said they were going to interview all these people and bring the findings back to their experts to determine if he was suicidal. I told them I thought it was murder," end quote. The reopening of the case went virtually unreported at the time, with very few outlets other than the Chronicle giving it any coverage at all. So it's hard to say the exact reason that it was done aside from possible political leverage. With the expiration of their deal fast approaching, it's possible that since the case relates to the intelligence backgrounds of Bush and other Republicans and could potentially expose a wealth of blackmail-worthy info on them, that it was done as a sort of protection against Clinton bashing by the Bush camp and others. That's just a theory though. In my opinion, that is just one surface level advantage, but the true reason for it runs much deeper. Without making this a 3-hour episode, I won't be able to lay it all out in depth, but I'm going to try and at least provide an outline, some breadcrumbs if you will, that you can look into should you feel so inclined. I suppose it starts with who actually ordered the review of the case. Surprisingly, on the surface at least, it came from someone within the DOJ itself, Associate Attorney General Webster Webb Hubbell, or Webby as I like to call him, to be precise, who was at the time the third highest ranking official at the Justice Department, a man who many regarded as the department's de facto head, as well as being a close friend to the Clintons. Hubbell had already been connected to the Inslaw affair via an interview by the Village Voice in 1992, where Michael Riconosciuto would disclose to Frank Snepp the link between guns and drug operations at the airstrip in Mena, Arkansas, which was a looming scandal for the Clintons due to Bill's refusal to investigate and alleged connections to it when he was the governor, as well as Park on Meter, or POM, which was, as the name suggests, a parking meter manufacturer in Russellville, Arkansas, which played a major role in making Hubbell one of the early victims of another Clinton scandal, the Whitewater affair. According to Snepp, Riconosciuto claimed to have worked with Terry Reed, the pilot who first disclosed information that brought the airstrip smuggling operation to national attention. Riconosciuto would tell Mark Sweeney, who at that time was head of a University of Arkansas student group that started a petition to have the Mena situation investigated, that Riconosciuto had been a part of a project to develop chemical and biological weapons connected to POM, that was also in connection to work done at Cabazon, and apparently POM also manufactured external fuel tanks for C-130 transport planes. I know this seems confusing and disconnected right now, probably, but that's kind of how Riconosciuto rolls. Just stick with me here. He also had told Scottish-born Irish-American political journalist Alexander Cockburn that he had supervised high-tech equipment transfers and developed software to help launder money at Mena, and explained that POM, along with Wackenhut and Stormont Labs, began production of the delivery system for the new chemical and biowarfare weaponry to be used in the Contra War in '83. Long-range transport to deliver to the Contras required the use of those external fuel tanks that POM had been producing. POM was to receive chemical agents from the 354th Chemical Company of the Army Reserve, which was located on property across from the building housing the POM facilities, for use in small explosive devices being made with some of the same equipment POM used to produce its parking meters. Yeah, we're going way down the rabbit hole here, but this is the key part. Stormont Labs would admit only to discussions with Wackenhut regarding biological weapons, and Wackenhut would flat out deny working with Palm. President of Palm, Seth Skeeter Ward II, who was also Hubbell's brother-in-law, by the way, who has a ridiculously typical rich guy name, admitted that the company had some Pentagon contracts, but only for, quote, re-entry nose cones for nuclear warheads on the MX missiles and nozzles for rocket engines, end quote, not chemical or biological weapons delivery systems. He would, however, confess to allegedly not knowing what kind of aircraft parts Palm made for one of its contracts with McDonnell Douglas. Ward would also deny another major allegation that Riconosciuto made, which was Palm receiving the first industrial development loan from the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, or ADFA, which is a whole story of its own. It's full of controversy, and it was co-written by Hubbell in '85. Clinton appointed every member of the ADFA's governing board and was required to approve every bond that it issued. It would seem with no other legislative means of ensuring that the money would be spent as intended or be accounted for. Needless to say, this opened up the door for massive amounts of corruption, which is precisely what happened. The two biggest players aside from Clinton was Stephens Inc., an investment bank that received about 78% of ADFA's underwriting fees and sales of housing and industrial bonds. Bear in mind, Clinton had appointed 2 associates from Stephens to the ADFA board, and known Clinton underling Dan Lassiter, whose firm Lassiter & Company underwrote $664 million in municipal bond issues. Lassiter was a well-known scumbag and party animal who was renowned for cocaine-fueled parties at his Arkansas mansion. He also claimed to have paid off drug debts of Bill's brother, Roger Clinton. Police would eventually investigate Lassiter in '85 on drug charges, and in '86 he was sentenced to 30 months in prison for cocaine distribution. His known co-conspirator, Roger Clinton, would of course not be indicted. Clinton would later pardon him. Despite Ward's denials of it, one of the first bonds it issued would go to Palm, with Clinton's approval. Now we get into the bigger picture and how this all connects back to Inslaw and the Octopus. It also touches on a much bigger story than I could ever hope to fully get into here, which was the death of Vince Foster. Palm admitting it had Pentagon contracts, a seemingly unusual thing for a supposed parking meter manufacturer to have to begin with, along with its suspicious financial connections, would largely go unnoticed by the media. Imagine that. But Hubbell's representation of them would become the official reason for his resignation from the DOJ only a month after reopening the Inslaw investigation, despite virtually no one even being aware of the whole situation. The Rose Law Firm claimed that Hubbell had failed to provide documentation for expenses that he had charged to the firm, and that Palm lost $1 million in litigation expenses when Hubbell attempted to pursue a patent infringement case that he had taken on a contingency basis for his brother-in-law Ward and was unsuccessful. Stating in his resignation letter, quote, "Unfortunately, because of public speculation about me and my former law firm, I will have to spend a significant amount of time on an internal matter with my former partners," end quote. His resignation succeeded in not only taking Palm out of the spotlight in Washington, but also shielded him from further accusations related to the Whitewater Development Corporation real estate investments. More specifically, Hubbell having served on the Resolution Trust Corporation during its takeover of the Madison Savings and Loan, which was owned by James McDougal, a partner in Whitewater that was previously represented by Hubbell. He failed to tell Resolution Trust Corporation of the potential conflict of interest. Hubbell was unofficially Whitewater's second victim. Its first came when White House counsel Bernard Nussbaum was forced to resign as a result of questionable meetings with federal regulators looking into the Whitewater Development Corporation's real estate investments. Nussbaum had been responsible for removing Whitewater files and a diary from the office of a White House aide named Vince Foster less than 3 hours after Foster's death by a gunshot wound through the mouth. Patsy Thomason was his accomplice in the theft. Foster spent his last weekend alive with Hubbell, his wife, and White House counsel Michael Cardozo and his wife. Hubbell would end up with the group in Maryland after he left the meeting that was to inform William Sessions of his dismissal as FBI director. Clinton spoke with Foster for approximately 20 minutes on the night before his death. One of Foster's last phone conversations on the morning of his death was with Brantley Buck, who was a Rose Law Firm partner and had been assigned to investigate Hubble and Palm. Foster wasn't just any White House aide. Foster was a childhood friend of Clinton, and when he died, he was handling early Clinton administration scandals that involved the FBI. Primarily, he was dealing with the Whitewater scandal at the time. Independent, using this term extremely sarcastically in this case, counsel Kenneth Starr would then take over investigating all these scandals, including Foster's death, which he would further assert was a suicide. Years later, he would, quote, admit to omitting information that Hillary Clinton had thoroughly embarrassed and berated Foster only days before his death in front of other aides and asserted that this most likely led to his suicide. He would state this piece of information many years later in a book that he wrote and said that he omitted this info from his original report in order to, quote, spare Hillary's feelings, end quote. Before, Starr was appointed to investigate the Whitewater scandal, as well as Foster's death in August of '94. The person formerly in charge of the investigation was Robert Fisk, who headed up the legal team that defended Exxon in litigation stemming from an oil spill that dumped 567,000 gallons of oil into Arthur Krill, New Jersey. He also defended Clark Clifford and Robert Altman for their involvement in the BCCI scandal, which was a major element in our Octopus story. Fisk had already released an interim report that concluded Bill Clinton and White House officials hadn't interfered with the Resolution Trust Corp and essentially cleared Clinton of his involvement in the Whitewater scandal. And his report also concluded Vince Foster's death was a suicide. Kenneth Starr basically just continued the complete cover-up that Fisk had already begun and laid out for him to follow. There are several other connections in all of this, way too many to really cover, but I encourage you to do some digging if you're interested. One more major Clinton connection comes by way of Hillary serving as the intellectual property lawyer for a company that obtained and marketed copies of the stolen and modified PROMIS software, Systematics Inc., which is located out of Little Rock, Arkansas, now known as Alltel. It was owned by Jackson Stevens of the aforementioned Stevens Inc. Stevens, I don't really know. I hate when people spell Steven with a PH. They were the owners of Northern Banking Corporation, which essentially bankrolled the majority of Clinton's '92 election campaign. Stevens was also a co-owner of the American branch of BCCI. Need I say more? After Hillary joined the Rose Law Firm, Stevens employed the firm and engaged its partners, including Hillary, Vince Foster, and Webster Hubble in several of his ventures. This is really all part of a much bigger series of scandals and interwoven events involving financial crimes, government corruption, multiple murders, and more. I just wanted to at least share a few pieces of info that begin to illustrate just how far the tentacles of this octopus truly reach, and how far this PROMIS rabbit hole actually goes. Part 3. What really happened to Alan Standorf? As we've seen in the course of this series, Alan Standorf was unquestionably in contact with Danny Casolaro before his untimely death, and had a major role in providing the last documents that Danny received, ones that suspiciously went missing, along with a case that contained the files that Danny had related to the darkest elements within the octopus. Who was he, though, and what led to his death 7 months before Danny's? Here's the condensed version of what we know. The rest remains shrouded in a thick veil of government secrecy and obstruction. First Lieutenant Alan David Standorf, shortly before his death, worked with, if not directly for, the NSA at what was at the time a joint U.S. Army and NSA listening post at Vent Hill Station. It was in 1990, the year before his death, that he turned whistleblower and reached out to Danny, providing him with information and copies of classified documents exposing a wide range of illegal activities by the government, including money laundering, bulk data collection, as well as allegedly the printouts of the REX-84 detailing the list of dissidents to be rounded up in the event of an emergency. Before all of this, though, Alan, along with his brother Gary, were military men. Alan was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army and assigned to military intelligence and the individual Ready Reserve in May of 1985, just 9 years after graduating high school and entering the service. His other brother, Mark, would state years after his death that he was commissioned in '86 after graduating from the University of Wisconsin. Again, as illustrated here, the exact dates and full nature of his service has been greatly obscured. At some point, though, his active status was canceled, and he went back into the reserves as a member of the 450th Civil Affairs Company, later the 450th Civil Affairs Battalion stationed in Riverdale, Maryland. The 450th is an element of Spec Ops Command and provided support to the parachute assault ops of the 82nd Airborne Division tasked with jumping into hostile zones. While in reserve status, he worked closely along with active military and military intelligence, as well as the NSA, and took a job at Vent Hills Farm Station, which operated as a listening post and processing point for signal intelligence, or SIGINT. In '87, the facility was turned over to the control of the Communications Electronics Command, or CEC, from the Intelligence and Securities Command, or INSCOM, that was previously over it. The CEC was based out of Fort Monmouth at the time, coincidentally the same place that his brother Gary had been stationed and put in charge of some of the computer networks. Gary and his wife were both computer systems programmers there at this point. Gary worked for the Army Information Systems Command, which is largely responsible for the engineering and integration of systems for the U.S. Army. Despite the similar and somewhat overlapping nature of their jobs, Gary didn't seem to know much more about the nature of Alan's work than the rest of his family seemed to. Only that Alan had mentioned that it was classified and dangerous, with his brother Mark describing the work as being, quote, for the war, whatever that means. The exact nature and scope of Alan's civilian work at Vent Hills is hard to pin down, and official documents and statements do little to shed any light on it, as most are conflicting. They range in their description as him being an NSA clerk, low-level analyst, to maintenance and distribution of equipment, and even overseeing security measures. This level of secrecy and conflicting reports is not unusual when dealing with military intelligence. If anything, it's a hallmark of it. Whatever he did, it afforded him enough access to provide Danny, who Michael Riconosciuto introduced him to, with classified documents with top secret and SCI, or special compartmentalized information, markings on them, according to friends and sources of Danny's who saw the documents, such as William Turner, who was the one that delivered the folder containing them and others to Danny the day before he was found dead in Martinsburg. These documents apparently provided proof that copies of PROMIS had been illegally sold to Canada, Australia, and Israel with the back door installed. The documents also provided some of the earliest info on Main Corps, as well as documenting money transfers between Adnan Khashoggi, Richard Secord, Ed Meese, and Earl Bryan, with some involving BCCI. Casillero would tell others that Standorf continued to provide other info for a bit, but then, quote, dried up. This was said at a time that lines up with Standorf's murder. Speaking of, it occurred not long after his resignation from Vent Hill on December 19, 1990, when he was called into active service. He would see his friends and family for the last time around New Year's, before traveling from Lehigh Valley to Fort Bragg to report for duty, when he seemingly just disappeared. The last time that he is reported seen was on January 1st, but detectives estimate that his death as having occurred on the 3rd. On January 4th, his car would be left in the short-term parking area at Reagan Airport, where it wouldn't be discovered for 24 days until January 28th at 9:45 p.m. by a policeman who was on patrol. He would also discover Standorf's body left in the back seat / floorboard, covered by jackets, clothing, and his suitcase. Because of the sensitive nature of his work, Army investigators and the FBI would be called into the scene along with local and airport police. After a few days of investigating, they concluded that it was a simple robbery due to the fact that, according to an ATM receipt, $500 was missing and his handgun was also. This would mean somewhere along his journey to Fort Bragg, he encountered a thief who either took the money he withdrew or forced him to take it out before killing him 2 days later on the 3rd, and then leaving his body at the airport on the 4th. So, after holding on to the body for a day or so, we're to believe that he dropped it off, not in the trunk, which would have made sense, but in the back of the car, and at a relatively high traffic area that received a great deal of attention, rather than dumping the body and taking his car, or at least dropping it off at a place that, I don't know, doesn't have surveillance cameras and a dedicated police force maybe. This fits less for a local robber than, say, a hitman who came from another area to do a job before boarding a flight out of the area, which is a fairly common technique used by professional killers. Not a robber motivated by $500 and a handgun. The FBI did remain doubtful of this conclusion, but the case never advanced. Due to the file still being open, however, the FBI still refused to release any info that they have related to Standorf and claim Exemption 7A to any FOIA request. Ask me how I know that. Moving on. there are simply too many elements to all of this to realistically take you guys down every single rabbit hole. If even after all of this you still have something that you would like to know more about in particular though, just let me know and I'll see what I can do. I'm sure the majority of listeners are no doubt tired of hearing about all of this though, so I won't go any further into it right now. The facts of the matter are this. Decades of government corruption would slowly get exposed in the course of the investigating and court procedure of the PROMIS Inslaw case. Danny, along with a long list of other journalists and people who simply got too close to it, would die in suspicious manners, with their deaths being ruled either suicides or being totally unconnected, despite clear evidence in most cases that they were involved in some way with PROMIS or the Octopus as a whole. This is commonly called the grandfather of all conspiracies because it has threads which connect through everything from the Kennedy assassination to the modern security state and touch on countless examples of corruption and malfeasance within the government in between. It's a case as fascinating as it is frustrating, and one that really deserves an honest look from someone in the government who isn't on the take, and with the balls to do the right thing. When or if we will ever have such a thing remains to be seen. For now though, I'm not holding my breath. Since today is Halloween and all, I'll share this. No case that I've ever dug into concerned me quite as much as this one, and it's not like I pick safe topics generally. I've experienced a few genuine oddities throughout this investigation as well that really hasn't helped that feeling. From documents going missing to having packages arrived open, including a laptop, it hasn't exactly given me any reassurance that I have nothing to worry about. So my CMA notice here at the end of this is all pure speculation, but all of my speculation data is backed up to a dead man switch, and I'm in no way suicidal or in bad health, just for the record. Now, here at the end, I had fully intended to put some sort of a Halloween thing together, maybe, talk about some of the spooky stories that I've been sent or other things that I've been through over the years. It just seems, it doesn't feel like Halloween this year. And I know I kind of said that last year, but this year, that feeling even seems more magnified. I don't know if that's because there's so many other things going on right now in the world or the seriousness of the situation that we really find ourselves in currently, but I found it difficult. I sat down and wrote for a little while, but nothing really seemed like it was worth doing, I guess. So forgive me that I'm not exactly in the Halloween spirit, but I sincerely hope that all of you have a fantastic Halloween and that you stay very safe out there. The world has become an increasingly crazy place, so just use caution, I guess. I do have another case coming up. I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to have that episode up because I'm still in the evidence gathering phase for it, but it's a big local story for the area that I'm in. It's something that I've been reached out to about covering and some people that need help, so this is an opportunity for me to actually do what I wanted to do more than anything with this podcast, and that is to help people. So I had to seize on that. And bear with me if it takes a few more weeks to get that next episode out, but I think that you will find it very compelling. It's a wild case. There's, everything from true crime to some truly deplorable behavior, and it desperately needs to be covered. So I'm looking forward to actually digging in and hopefully helping some people with that one. We have a critical election coming up here in the United States. I've never been one to put my political leanings into this show very much. I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Democrat. I guess you would call me an independent, but really I just call it being logical. I think that we should get away from that party mentality and start looking at candidates for what they are and who they are and judging them by their deeds and not by their words. I think that that's very crucial, particularly right now. We're on the cusp of multi-theater wars, some potentially involving nuclear weapons. This isn't really a time to just buy into blue no matter who, or whatever slogan you have to vote for anybody as long as they align with your political party. This is a time to really look at the facts. Don't listen to the media. I swear, the U.S. is really the only country that watches the news and believes that it is just verifiable, unbiased facts, and that it isn't some form of state-sponsored, largely propaganda that's used to control and manipulate your opinions, and isn't a highly carefully curated vision that they're wanting you to see so that you follow that path. Every other country watches the news, some, but all of them recognize it for what it is. And it's kind of staggering that even after the church committee, even after everything that's come out, after the stuff with COVID, after watching all these compilations that are out there of every single station and affiliate, regardless of which brand they come from, all saying the same script together, you can time them up. People still believe that this is just journalism. That is not journalism, folks. The only real journalism left is in the independent media sphere. Outside of that, the mainstream media is completely captured. It's time to recognize that. And it's time to start thinking for ourselves, doing our own research, and escaping from at least that little microcosm of this matrix of control that we find ourselves in. That's just my take on it. Again, I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, but I am here to tell you that you should not vote along the same lines that you've always voted just because you like their color, just because that's your team. This election is far too critical to do that. And this is coming from someone, I'll go ahead and tell you, I was a lifelong Democrat. It represented the values that I thought, at least when I was younger, that, I thought represented me. Against war, pro-freedom of speech, against the big corporations and big money. It just seemed like the right thing. But I've watched that party morph into something that stands for the exact opposite of all of those values. And it's been very painful to watch, because I really, really did not like the Republicans.
Especially during the Bush years, both of them.
And there's still a lot of them that I really don't like. So it's not like I flip parties. I just stopped believing in there actually being a true duality there.
It's just that old two wings, same bird thing,
It's just dog and pony shows, bread and circus, political theater. You've got to get to the meat of the matter and stop trusting everything that you hear on TV. I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir here, knowing that you guys listen to this show. You probably don't buy into the media machine, but I just felt it was very important to put that kind of stuff out there right now, because we are in a very critical time for this country and the world as a whole. And the decisions that we make as a country, in the coming weeks is going to determine a whole lot for the entire world. And the world is watching. I hope that you will vote with your conscience and that you will actually turn out, because this is, up until Trump won, I honestly couldn't tell you that we still had any sort of sway in the election process. But there's no way that they wanted him to win. They were all in on Hillary. So the fact that he was able to upset that, honestly, renewed faith, even though I hated the guy at the time, honestly renewed faith that we do have some effect. Our votes are counted. Now, the following time, I do believe that there is a margin of which that vote can be affected. So if you are wanting to see an upset here, I guess I would call it, then we're going to have to exceed that cheat margin. If you know, you know. And that's the only way that it's going to happen, because you can rest assured that some crazy things are going to happen coming up on this election, which is a whole can of worms that I don't really want to get into right now. But yeah, just be careful out there, guys. I don't know. This is a very scary and unhinged time for the country, for sure. So take care out there. And it's so great to be back with you. I promise that I'll get that next episode out just as soon as I possibly can. As always, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other if you can. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.